It's actually coordinated by two NGOs from Kerala. One is called Kottayam Nature Society. The other one is the Alapi Naturalist Society. So these are the two NGOs which started doing this. They do a lot of conservation work there. So anyway, we all locked up in our houses. So we thought instead of just spending our time, killing our time, watching some movies or other than doing some other, let's hear from people who knows about stuff about wildlife, animals, and different things. So yesterday, Dr. Ravi Chalam spoke about Asiatic lions, and so that was amazing. I mean, today we have a young blood, Sridhar, is going to talk about elephants. I mean, uh, Sridhar. I mean, it is funny. I mean, I didn't know about Sridhar. At least I met him a few years back, but I couldn't recall him. My friends only told me, you have to call Sridhar to give a talk on elephants. He's amazing. So then I figure out. I mean, he's from my home state itself. We have some common friends also. He done quite a few studies in. He's been always interested in elephants. I mean, when he give an introduction to himself, he'll give this introduction, but still, he's always been interested in elephants, and he done studies in Annamalai Tiger Reserve plus Parambiculam, all those places. Anyway, it will be a hope we can learn a lot from him. Over to you, Sridhar.
Thanks, David. It's indeed wonderful to be here this evening. In fact, following people like Dr. Ravi Chalam, and all is quite a bit of a challenge. In fact, to give a technical or rather a non-technical talk to a larger audience like this. But nevertheless, it's been a great pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting both to David personally and to Kottayam Nature Society and the Alapi Natural History Society. Just to briefly tell you a bit about myself, I am from Kerala, from the northern part of Kerala, this town called Calicut. And I have a bachelor's in forestry, a master's in wildlife biology and conservation. And currently, I'm just nearing the end of my PhD. I'm just wrapping up my PhD work. And hopefully, once the lockdown is lifted, I get to progress it a little bit more. My PhD work was primarily a step ahead of what I did for my master's, wherein I was interested in understanding hormonal and behavioral responses of elephants. In the sense, stress hormone and behavioral responses of elephants to anthropogenic pressures such as drive operations. I'll get to that in a bit when I talk about conservation challenges. And my PhD is looking at some of these aspects in greater detail with primary focus on female Asian elephants. And my larger landscape of interest has always been the Annamalais. I started off working in the Valparai region for my master's and then expanded to the Annamalai Tiger Reserve and Parambiculam Tiger Reserve subsequently for my PhD work. We've done some landscape level surveys and demographic surveys and so on, looking at distribution, various factors, population structure, distribution, and so on. So I'll try it as much as possible. I've tried to make it as less technical as possible, so as to reach out to a wider audience, of course. But if you have any other technical questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. So to get to the talk, this, as David also recognized a while ago, is an image that many of you perhaps might have seen already on social media or in documentaries and so on. This was a drone photograph shot by photographer Kalyan Verma a couple of years ago from a part of my study area called the Valparai region. So this is a rainforest fragment found in Valparai. It just gives you an idea of how intact even some of these fragments are. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that this is typically how undisturbed or relatively undisturbed rainforest areas look like without any kind of anthropogenic pressures. Now, this is the magnitude of human population growth that we are talking about, almost on a day-to-day basis. So this is again a drone photograph shot by Kalyan from a crowded event in Kerala. Some of you might be knowing this. This is the Thrissur Puram. So the point is, when rainforest areas and relatively undisturbed contiguous forests are threatened by anthropogenic pressures of such great magnitude, what happens is, in turn, they all get fragmented into bits and pieces such as these. And these are typically what you see in landscapes like Valparai, Munnar, and several other plantation landscapes. So the larger 220 square kilometer Valparai plateau, for instance, has been cut open for tea, coffee, and cardamom plantations about 100 years ago during the British rule. And what are remaining of these once pristine rainforest areas are these small fragments. And what is really amazing, or what is really special about these fragments, is that despite all the disturbances they have underwent over the last 100-120 years, these fragments do support large numbers of wildlife, ranging all the way from amphibians and reptiles to megafauna like elephants. It is quite remarkable indeed to see how extensively even such disturbed or secondary habitats are used by species such as elephants. We'll get to that in a bit. In such contexts, so that is also the reason why I thought it is important to talk about the Anthropocene. So in the Anthropocene, or today's era, where there's a lot of human-induced pressures on the natural ecosystems, there are also various kinds of animal behavioral adaptations, behavioral, physiological, demographic adaptations, or responses in some sense, that we have been seeing on a regular basis, because that in some sense is extremely important for them to ensure their survival. You see birds nesting on high mast lights, and monkeys begging for food, sometimes getting aggressive. You also see bears and other large wildlife in the urban spaces of countries like United States. And then you also have species like the puma. In India, the classic example, in some sense, the Masni idol, or the poster animal of urban wildlife is perhaps the leopard, which has been documented scientifically and even has featured in movies, for instance, Marathi movies. The celebrity leopards of Sanjay Gandhi National Park and adjoining areas in Maharashtra. Now, for a species like the leopard or the puma or the primates, for instance, with their smaller body size and their agility and so on, could be easier to subsist in an anthropogenic landscape with relatively less chances of getting detected by humans. But perhaps that's not the case really when it comes to animals like elephants, for instance. This was a photograph from a few years ago, this was around 2015, when this huge Makna, tuskless adult male, was found wandering through the streets of Guwahati. And finally, the animal had to be darted, tranquilized, and then airlifted and loaded onto a truck, and then it was translocated later. But that said, except for stray incidents like these in the Anthropocene, you are actually seeing that elephants are capable of being extremely adaptable in several areas. For instance, even in the outskirts of Bangalore, you go to the hub of software in southern India, Electronic City. Just outside Electronic City, you will get to see large numbers of elephants very often. So coming back to the plantation landscape of Valparai, so like I said, elephants have been extremely adaptable and have, in some sense, learned to live in a fragmented landscape like this. And they're also, and it's not just, there are lots of arguments that elephant populations in urban spaces or fragmented habitats or disturbed habitats do not tend to be, they don't tend to be viable in some sense. However, on the contrary, what we have been seeing, for instance, be it in landscape like Valparai or in another landscape where my colleagues have been working on, called Hassan, which is another very famous area for human, or infamous for human-elephant negative interactions, ranging from human deaths to crop loss and so on. In both these landscapes, we are actually seeing that the animals are not just thriving there, they are breeding. The adult female to calf ratio, or the demographic parameters, seem comparable with those of relatively undisturbed areas, perhaps indicating that the populations are doing quite well. So that brings me to the larger context and the title of my talk today, which is Elephants in the Anthropocene. This image, this image is one of my all-time favorites. This was one of my first instances. This was roughly about 7 years ago in 2013. This is a place in Coimbatore, just outside Coimbatore, on the way to Sakon, a place called Anuavi. where elephants used to frequent, they continue to use that area quite extensively. There's a temple right in the middle of the Tadagam RF called the Anuvavi Subramanya Temple, and elephants used to come there quite often. But what really acted negatively for these animals is that in due course of time, people started feeding these animals, including the priest of the temple, apparently, which in some sense habituated these animals to human presence or human pressures. And they started coming to these urban spaces or human dominated spaces on a fairly regular basis. The tusker in the front, of course, you can't see his features to actually identify him, but that is Chinnathambi. Chinnathambi is this tusker who was, going all over the media last year because of his 120 kilometer wandering after being relocated. I'll talk about all those as I explore the life of elephants in the Anthropocene. This cartoon by Arjun Srivatsa is one of my all-time favorites. There has been extensive habitat fragmentation, as I mentioned earlier, in most elephant landscapes. So as you can see in this cartoon, elephants actually asking Siri, where is the migratory route? So not exactly migratory route, but even their habitats are actually getting lost extensively. So this is a graphic that I could find online, which shows the elephant habitats available across elephant range countries, the 13 elephant range countries, back in the 1900s. And the animation actually shifts to 1990s. And you can see how pocketed and how reduced elephant ranges have been in the past 100 odd years. And there was a very nice work done by Peter Lemgruber from the Smithsonian way back in 2003, looking at available elephant habitats through remotely sensed imagery. And what they found was that in about 3 to 4 decades from 2003, so since about 1970s and so on, 1960s and 70s, there's been extensive habitat loss that it almost went down by about 50%. So that, in some sense, explains the extent of pressure put on these animals in terms of adapting and responding to these changes. So that also intensified the human-elephant interface. I would perhaps restrain myself from calling it conflict, because there are many occasions where there isn't exactly negative interaction for that matter. So like in some of these images, the elephants are just moving through, perhaps with very minimal damage. For instance, the image on the right top from Valparai, the animals are just using the plantation. And perhaps they're also doing good for the planters because they feed a lot on the undergrowth. So to put it on a lighter note, they're perhaps doing weeding operations for the planters. So they are being plantation friendly. Now the point is, a lot of these interactions are neutral or neutral in nature, that you can't necessarily call it conflict. So I'm trying to call it interactions here, be it positive or negative. And why this has intensified over the past few years, because of barriers and obstacles to movement. I mean, look at how several of these linear intrusions have expanded over the past couple of decades, not even century, or even the last decade or so. Not just linear intrusion, there have been large-scale developmental projects that have been sanctioned in several areas. We all know about the refinery in Assam, and of course, there have been online campaigns about the Italian hydroelectric project today. So there are several such developmental projects that are coming up closer to natural habitats, several of them even in elephant habitats, elephant landscapes, in some sense threatening their existing available habitats. So that also increases the competition for their forage and water requirements. And as a result, the animals have no other choice but to respond and adapt more. That's exactly what I was mentioning earlier as well. Now, this is typically what we have been seeing now in many landscapes. So this is a picture from Valparai. I wouldn't call this conflict. Again, there's no damage here. People are very calmly standing and watching this elephant. This is in the middle of the day, back in August 2014. And this particular elephant, we used to call her Monica. And we used to call that, or we used to say that Monica is in some sense the poster girl of coexistence program in Valparai, because she used to actually illustrate through her life to us that coexistence with a fight-on animal for a 50-kilogram human is perhaps possible with very minimal losses on either, very minimal or no losses on either sides. So here the animal is actually feeding from the backyard of a house. He's feeding on jackfruits. There's no loss. In a while, in about about an hour or so, the animal actually moved away, and people got back to their normal chores. So this is actually what got me interested in this as well, in terms of academic, in terms of my academic objectives or academic interests as well. So largely, my area of research is at the interface of these three broad areas: the conservation, behavior, or animal behavior, and physiology. Within physiology, to be precise, I'm looking at wildlife endocrinology because I'm interested in looking at stress and reproductive hormones. And in case of physiology, we are also looking at their body composition score. So broadly calling it conservation physiology. And conservation physiology over the past few years has actually developed as a discipline, which people testify that is a good short-term measure to look at the impact of certain developmental projects or certain anthropogenic pressures on animal life history processes. This was a nice illustration that or a nice cartoon that I had actually made for one of our papers a few years back. The larger issue of conflict, what I was mentioning earlier, while I prefer to call it interaction, the larger literature still calls it conflict. While I or many of my colleagues prefer to call it interaction rather. So in this case, for instance, what turns out to be human-wildlife conflict. So it is the problem of conflict, of course, is intense. There are losses on both sides. We'll talk about that in a bit. But before that, the larger problem of conflict is to do with the attitude and perception of the communities who are, affected by the problem. Because in many cases, perceived conflict is actually intense than the actual conflict. And I guess the lockdown is perhaps one of the best period to testify this, because in many areas, apparently, there's been a drop in reported number of conflict incidents, simply because earlier, or even in the absence of lockdown, for instance, the mere sighting of a wild animal in a human use area gets reported as conflict. Perhaps it is time for us to actually start rethinking whether that is actually conflict. And also, it is the time where we need to really realize that with a lot of these species, including elephants for that matter, in several landscapes, coexistence perhaps is the only way forward. Now, if you look at this, where people perceive animals to be are typically protected areas. In a lot of these conflict landscapes, I still remember this plenary talk by Ravi Chellam that I had attended a few years ago, and he was telling how a lot of people in Gujarat tend to say that take your lions away to the forest department people. And that's exactly what happens in many landscapes with species like elephants or tigers or leopards. So the larger perception of people still continues to be that animals have to be within protected area. But if you actually look where animals are, they are in protected areas, they are in human use landscapes, and they're also in forest plantation interfaces like Valparai, for instance. For habitat specialists, let's say some habitat specialists like lion-tailed monkeys, it might be a little, it might take a little more time for them to actually adapt to these changes and ensure their survival. But at the same time, for habitat generalists like leopards or elephants, these ecological and behavioral adaptations are even short-term, that they tend to learn or adapt quite well to live in human use landscapes, as we have been seeing in different examples. Some really complex habitat specialists could suffer because of these habitat loss and meet with extinction risks, which some of these lesser known taxa, for instance, could perhaps meet with extinction risk in such contexts. And in some sense, this image summarizes the issue of elephant conservation, the issue of elephant research, and the larger issue of human-elephant conflict mitigation in our country. Because the person who actually felt the legs of the elephant thought it was pillar. The person who felt the tail thought it was like a broom, and so on. And that's exactly what is happening. In one way, we think that the elephant-proof trenches would work, doesn't work. We think the electric fences would work, may not really work, simply because the animals are also learning, and I'll show a few videos to show how animals have been responding to some of these things. And there's unfortunately been very little comprehensive attempts to. The larger issue is also that we look at the problems from the perspective of humans, and then identify solutions for dealing with the animal, which is one reason why a lot of these mitigation measures have been a failure. Now, the second thing is, it is also important for us to acknowledge that human wildlife conflict, particularly in the case of human elephant conflict, it's a larger social issue. A few years back, about half a decade ago, when we were just initiating our research in the Hasan landscape in Karnataka, my colleague Vinod and I went there and did a reconnaissance survey across the villages, trying to understand what people thought were actual problems. Till then, Hasan had witnessed about 46 elephant captures in a period of 20 years. And despite all those captures, the problem continued to persist. Elephants. It was thought that the landscape is closed, but elephants kept coming back. So clearly, the landscape was not closed. Now, when we spoke to the local communities, several issues that they raised. A few of them, of course, reported about crop losses because of elephants, paddy and banana and jackfruit, and several other crop losses because of elephants. But the larger issue that was being reported were all social issues. People getting off from buses late in the night at the bus stop and walking back home in the dark. There are no proper street lighting. And sometimes there are no buses that they have to walk back from the marketplace till their house, again in the dark. So that's lack of organized public transport. So considering that these are issues that have eventually led to negative interactions between elephants and humans, like I was mentioning earlier, it is really important that we acknowledge the fact that it is a social issue. And before even we look at the problem as something caused by the animal and devising solutions for the animal, it is or even looking at the animal's behavior, it is important that we look at human behavior. And there is this larger argument that increasing number of elephants is what is contributing to increasing conflict incidents across India or across range countries. I wouldn't confidently talk about the other range countries because I've never worked there. With India, at least, I would agree with Stephen Blake and Simon Hedges, where in their 2004 magnum opus paper, they write that the frequently cited global estimate of Asian elephants is often acknowledged as little more than an educated guess. However, conservationists and the media have repeated this estimate so often that it has come to be accepted as a fact. Astonishingly, these estimates of the global population have been accepted without revision for a quarter of a century. And I think it's not, this was way back in 2004. Now another 16 years have passed. So it's not even quarter of a century. You can actually include another 16 years to it. It's been almost 4 decades since we have been talking about this guesstimate of Asian elephants across their range. And this is particularly applicable for a country like India, where if you look at the elephant habitats, so you can't even in some sense compare it with Africa, because you have the Africa. So if you want to count the African savanna elephants, most of them are open habitats. You can deploy methods like capture, recapture, capture, mark, recapture, and so on. But that perhaps may not really apply well in Asian context, because particularly in India, they range all the way from dry thorn habitats in places like Coimbatore, Satyamangalam, Chinnar, and several other areas, all the way till high elevation grasslands, high elevation wet temperate forests or the Shola forest, evergreen forest, where for you to see the animal itself, it takes days or weeks or even months of effort. You would only hear them, or you would miss out on them. We have attempted several methods. We have tried doing transect surveys as part of my PhD work itself. We have tried doing transect surveys to look at dung count. We have looked at dung decay rates, their defecation rates, and we have found that it is extremely variable. That the estimates that you probably arrive at using some of these numbers perhaps may not give you the right estimates of elephants using a landscape, because the estimate that you are arriving at is also subject to extrapolation, because you're only sampling a certain area. And through our work and several other work in the past, we have also come to know that even if you take Annamalai, for instance, not the entire 5,600 to 6,000 odd square kilometer area of Annamalai is being used by elephants. Several of that have very difficult slopes, and it is known that difficult slopes, Very, very rare cases, we have observed bull elephants, navigating some of these difficult terrains. But largely, if you see, most of these mountainous slopes or cliff edges are not used by elephants regularly. So that again becomes a constraint in terms of population estimation. There are certain landscapes like, let's say, Bandipur, Nagarhole and all, where you could probably rely on elephant counting using line transect methods or capture recapture, direct sighting based capture recapture and so on. So having said that, like I said, it is very difficult to actually arrive at exact numbers for several of these landscapes, and unless we really have evidence to show that, and more importantly, the larger argument of elephant numbers going up, I'm really not sure if we have we really I don't really think that we have the numbers from 1970s or 80s to actually say that in the last 30 years elephant numbers have gone up. That would be stretching the argument extremely bit. Stretching the argument a lot, because if you look at 1970s or 1980s, they have all been educated guesses, like what Stephen and Simon have argued. And simply because of that, I think our estimates have probably been closer to being reliable only since the 2000s. So it is also not a very long period to say that the animal populations have gone up. Now, what has caused a lot of these interactions? I'll come back to what I was mentioning earlier. Human or anthropogenic pressures. There are linear intrusions like roads, population, landscapes being cleared up for several other activities, including agriculture and industrial establishments and so on. Other changes in human behavior, for instance, so the image on the left, where elephants are actually feeding at a garbage yard. So it's this famous garbage yard, one of those famous garbage yards where elephants frequent in southern part of Sri Lanka. I've been there a few times, and I've seen how used to elephants are, even to vehicles. So the garbage, particularly vegetable waste, there is dumped twice a week. And in some sense, they seem to have tuned their movement patterns also in accordance to that. That in the other days, if you actually go there, it's very difficult to see these animals. So perhaps it was, really important to rethink before allocating that land for being designated as a garbage yard, for instance. So in Sri Lanka, it's very tricky, because if you actually see, it's Department of Forest and Department of Wildlife. The elephants are the responsibility of Department of Wildlife, and this land that has been designated and allocated as a garbage yard is actually a Department of Forest land. So the Department of Forest can actually assign their land for any project for that matter. Because of these interactions, the kind of interactions that I just mentioned, many cases. So there's a collared bull moving through the sugarcane area, which is again Chinnathambi in this case. There are also windmills at the back. So a large extent of elephant habitats have been lost, even in the foothills of Annamalai, for instance, to coconut groves, sugarcane plantations, and towards the other side, closer to Palni Hills, in the form of wind farms and so on. There's also paddy. For an animal, particularly, bulls like Chinnathambi, coming into this area, there's paddy here, there's sugarcane, and then you have coconuts at the backyard. It's a 7-course meal for them. It's extremely rich nutrition, and typically bulls have to put in a lot of effort to bulking up, and then they eventually come into must, which is an expensive affair in terms of their dietary or in terms of their resource requirements. So because of that, there's a lot of crop damage. This image is from Hassan below. Overnight, an entire stretch of paddy was damaged by elephants. The image on the right side bottom is from Valparai, and this at one point of time used to be a regular affair, where these properties used to be hit by elephants in search of stored rice or other grains, which has come down, of course, thanks to the interventions by Nature Conservation Foundation in the form of early warning systems. But this used to be a regular. So these are the kind of losses that we are talking about. In terms of loss of lives of both elephants and humans, it has been quite unfortunate, because this is probably the sad part of negative, and this is exactly what we largely refer to as conflict. The image on top, for instance, is that is a very viral video a few years ago when this young male actually ventured out into the streets of Mysore town, and then this ATM watcher was actually killed by the elephant. No, those are really, really unfortunate situations. And there are also conflict situations like on the right, for instance, in Northeast and other places where animals are actually electrocuted or poisoned and killed in defense of crops. Not exactly retaliation, because retaliation is when you kill the same animal, or you kill an animal in response to losses that you have incurred. In this case, it's mostly killing in defense, for instance. There are also large-scale human life losses. But the tricky part is that we continue to quote the government estimates of 2010 from the Elephant Task Force report called the Gaja, where they talked about 100 elephants and 400 humans losing their lives to conflict annually. I think in some sense it's also time to revise this. Thankfully, the government has actually revised this number of human deaths since last year. Now they've started mentioning that 100 elephants and 500 humans. But it's surprising that the elephant numbers never got revised, because the report is from 2010. It's been 10 years since then. And if you actually look at the number of elephant deaths due to various conflict-related issues, it's definitely close to 200. At least, even if you look at a reported number of incidents, do a random Google search, look at the number of conflict-related elephant deaths reported, so including train track deaths, rail track deaths, electrocution, poisoning, snaring, and so on. Or even getting shot, for instance, contributes to easily close to 200 elephant deaths. So when we talk about elephant population growth, like I was mentioning earlier, we also fail to account for this conflict-related mortality, for instance. And so if you look at the larger Asian elephant range across 13 countries, two large populations, of course, are in India and Sri Lanka. And if you are to compare between the numbers of India and Sri Lanka, in India, let's say it's about 150 people and 400 to 450 humans every year. And in Sri Lanka, it's just the opposite, wherein about 100 people or 75 to 100 people get killed by elephants every year. But at the same time, about 200 to 300 elephants get killed because of conflict in the form of getting shot or poisoned. What is really important in terms of conflict mitigation? So I'm borrowing a couple of slides from my colleague, Dr. Anand, who's been studying conflict in the Valparai landscape, in Valparai and a few other landscapes over the past 2 decades now. What is really important to understand, because the point of perception and attitude mattering in case of human-wildlife conflict, for instance, can be dealt with only if you are able to bring down the number of human deaths, for instance. So in Valparai earlier, the average number of human deaths used to be about 3 to 4 per year, which has now come down to 1. And we have also had several years, for instance, where there have been 0 deaths reported because of elephant attacks. So if you look at the context, so this is slightly old data. This is about 3-year-old information, but out of 41 cases analyzed, in 36 of the cases, people were unaware of elephant presence. And this is exactly what I mentioned earlier. This is, and even if you look at the other causes of death, for instance, in this plot, in this graph, it talks about unexpected accidental encounters, inadequate safety at work and home. So this all points out to the larger issue of conflict being a social concern rather than an ecology or an animal behavior issue. This is exactly what is being seen in Coimbatore Forest Division, for instance, where most number of deaths, 42 out of 55 cases, were reported because of unexpected accidental encounters. And I haven't added additional information here, but what is important is this is exactly the trend that you're seeing in several other landscapes like Gudalur or Hassan, for instance, which are all designated within quotes as conflict hotspots, for instance. Now, if you are able to tackle this issue, so the basic principle behind the establishment of the early warning system, and I guess to a certain extent the success of the early warning system has been because it communicates to people about elephant presence, thereby aiding them in avoiding some of these unexpected accidental encounters. Now, how the larger popular perception or how conflict being reported in media, for instance, affects animal, the larger public attitude towards the species also matters. Even today, for instance, if you actually look at a lot of these media reports, they continue to call elephants as rogues. And we've done some massive campaigns. We have tried talking to media people. We have conducted workshops for them. We've conducted workshops for even local journalists at places like Valpare, Pollachi, Coimbatore, and so on. And even in places like Wayanad, for instance, we have done media workshops to try and make them aware that the kind of terminologies that they use, elephants going on rampage and elephants being rogue and so on. And unfortunately, this is not very different even in scientific literature, for instance, where there have been studies which have quoted accidental human deaths caused by elephants as manslaughter, for instance. Now, when such perception are becoming, more wide, when larger public actually starts accepting such thought processes, calling accidental human deaths as manslaughter or elephants as rogues, the immediate response, of course, is to remove these problem animals, just like what has happened in Hassan, for instance, which has caused to removal of about 60 odd elephants in the last 25 years, for instance. Now, none of these actually contributes to mitigation of conflict. So this is the second important. The first one was about population monitoring. The second important conservation challenge in the Anthropocene of Asian elephants that I wanted to talk about is in terms of managing some of these conflict situations. So there are fences. Clearly, you can see that this mother and juvenile is actually trying to bring down the fence so that they can cross and come over. But a lot of vegetation occurring over there. There's a lot of undergrowth, which of course renders the electric fence futile, and thereby easy for the elephants to bring it down and then cross over and come this side. That's the biggest challenge because in many places, for instance, the local communities put the entire onus on the local authorities, the forest department people, for not just establishment of the fence. Even if you establish the fence, you put all the installation costs, you put all the initial expenses, they would still expect you to maintain things like very minor things. So if it's just a small farmland, even for that, several people actually are very hesitant to do basic maintenance works, such as clearing vegetation under these fences, for instance. I had actually seen that in many cases in Sri Lanka, for instance, the fences have been working extremely well. I should also give you an example where I actually saw this, because in many places, so this is an image from Valpare where the elephants are trying to cross the fence. In Valpare, we usually see groups of groups ranging from one, so mostly solitary males, but that's very rare in a place like Valpare, for instance. But if you look at group numbers, they range from all the way from 5 to 15, for instance. At the same time, in a place like Sri Lanka, so one of my PhD supervisors, Dr. Prithviraj Fernando, had actually taken me to a couple of paddy fields and shown me how the fences have been quite effective. So what they call as seasonal fences. The fences are put up when the paddy starts growing a little bit, and then they are maintained by the farmers themselves. And after about 70 days or so, 60 to 70 days, when paddy is harvested, the fences are removed, and the fencing material is very safely stored in these farmers' houses or storeyards or whatever. And the harvested field is then left open for the elephants so that they can feed on the residual matter. Now here, because it's short-term period, it's easy for the farmers to actually maintain compared to year-round things, for instance. So it's just that 2-month or 3-month period of maintenance cost that they have to meet. As a result, fences are very, very well maintained. They're always functional. And because of that, to a greater extent, and particularly in north central and northwestern provinces of Sri Lanka, they've been able to deal with crop losses in many areas. The magnitude of problem that you see in places like Sri Lanka is quite big, because one evening, after we visited one of these paddy fields, we decided to so there are these large water bodies that are used for irrigation of these paddy fields. We decided to actually go wait at the sides of one of these water bodies, again, north central part of Sri Lanka. And we were expecting elephants to come there. So in a while, in about half an hour, 45 minutes, elephants started coming. We started counting the animals also. And you won't believe that evening we actually saw 78 elephants. Now imagine 78 elephants walking through a paddy field. Now, even if they don't feed on them, if it's like a hectare or a 2-hectare paddy field, even if these 78 elephants just move through, because of trampling damage, the entire crop gets lost. That is exactly where these well-maintained fences have been a success. And unfortunately, in many of our areas, for instance, because the locals expect somebody else to maintain it for them, or the forest department to maintain it for them, it's been a challenge. It's been a failure. Now, on the right top, you have elephants walking through what is supposedly called an elephant-proof trench. It's quite ironic, in many places, in places like Wayanad, for instance, if you Wayanad, Coimbatore, many of those places, if you recommend something like elephant-proof trenches, these places are all high rainfall areas, and obviously there's going to be a lot of siltation inside the elephant-proof trench. And elephants are quite intelligent enough to find out weak points in the trench and then try and cross over. So this was again in Coimbatore, and they had actually found out that there's one point where they could get down into the fence and then walk through to the trench, and then walk through the trench without getting detected. So if you look at from a faraway distance, because of the vegetation and the heaps of mud put on either side, you can't see elephants walking through this trench. So they would move through the trench for long distances, about half a kilometer or so, without being detected, and then move over to the crop landscapes. The third image on left bottom is one of the images from Kalyan series on Hassan elephant capture, which happened in 2013-2014. 17 elephants were taken into permanent captivity, and 5 elephants were taken from Hassan during the same period, and then were translocated to Hills. Unfortunately, there have been a lot of reports of deaths of elephants, and like we have also come across elephant Ranga getting hit by a public transport vehicle along the highway. Drona are dying because of heat stress or whatever. So there have been lots of deaths in captivity also. So if conservation is the larger goal, then capturing elephants to mitigate conflict is something that definitely needs to be rethought about. But more importantly, looking at the more logical point of view, from the more logical point of view, there are written evidences of capturing elephants from the Hassan landscape all the way from 1970s and 1980s. There are forest department reports where they have indicated that so many numbers of elephants were actually captured from that landscape. But despite all that, it is assumed that the landscape is closed, it has no connectivity. But for an elephant, for instance, it doesn't necessarily have to have forests as connectivity. Hassan and adjoining Kodagu, for instance, predominantly coffee landscape. And these are all mostly Robusta coffee, which are these really tall plants. And there are nice shade trees, which are mostly jackfruit. So when the elephant gets into this, there's a lot of resource. There are ponds in between which provides water. And because of the cover that the Robusta coffee and the trees within provide to the animal, they use that as daytime refuges. And more importantly, they also use these as connecting pathways between the adjoining protected areas and the Hassan landscape itself. Because if you look at the forest area available within Hassan, it's pretty negligible. It's very little. But despite that, our database itself has close to 40 individuals identified. There's also some amount of turnover happening. There are, we continue to see newer individuals coming into the landscape, which clearly indicates that there is movement between the northern and southern parts of the landscape. Sagleshpur and other areas on the north, and Nagaroli on the south. There have also been several translocation attempts. The image on the right side bottom was the translocation of an elephant from Annur near Satyamangalam, Annur near Coimbatore to Satyamangalam, today's Satyamangalam Tiger Reserve. And I'll talk about what happened to it a bit later when I talk about translocations in particular. Coming back to the larger issue of how media portrayal has been detrimental to species, species conservation largely. So there was this elephant that was fondly called Chakamadan in Pepara Wildlife Sanctuary a decade and a half ago. This was way back in 2005. And by 2006, there was also a lot of media reports coming up about this animal. And by then, there were a few accidental deaths that were attributed to this animal. Now, my question is that most of these deaths caused by elephants are often at night. Very rarely do other people get to see somebody being killed by an elephant, for instance. So in such cases, how do we even narrow down to an elephant saying, "Oh, this was the only," and many of these landscapes actually have multiple elephants using the same area during the same time. So it's really tricky for somebody to actually pinpoint and say that, "Oh, it was this particular individual that actually caused these series of human deaths, and the animal needs to be removed." So the animal was named Kolagoli, which from Malayalam to English translates to murderer, or the supreme murderer. Eventually, the animal, had a very bad death. It was taken into captivity, and finally, the animal had cardiac failure or whatever. Whatever be the reason, the animal was finally killed. So some of the mahouts who were actually leading the Kumkis in this operation had told me this story a while ago. Who were being part of this operation actually told me this story that the very first time they saw this elephant, which was I think sometime in May or June 2006, about 2 or 3 weeks before this capture happened. I think in summer 2006. They told me that the dung of the animal was predominantly filled with undigested matter, clearly showing that the animal's dentition had some issues or even digestive problems in the animal. And they also told me that the fecal matter or the dung of the animal was having extremely pungent odor as well. Also showing that probably there were other health abnormalities that the animal was suffering from. So perhaps none of this was taken. So even if the animal was left back in the wild, it would have probably died a natural death. But of course, death was made faster in this case by taking it into captivity. So I should actually call this the death of three. So this was an article that was written long back by one of our colleagues, Dr. Shankar Raman, about the death of 2 Osamas. So there were 2 elephants that were named after the notorious Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden, and were shot to death in the northeastern state of Assam. It was really tragic because at the first place, the whole cultural connection with the animal being, living symbol of Ganesha is being lost. The animal is being called Osama, and then finally the animal succumbing to death, or shot to death. And despite all that, last year, for instance, in November 2019, there was another third case where another elephant was named Osama, and that was also eventually. So in this case, at least the animal was not shot dead, but again, the animal was captured, was taken into captivity, and finally, it died a tragic death inside the kraal. When it comes to translocation, in his classic paper in 2008, talking about translocation, Dr. Prithviraj Fernando, and in 2014, Dr. Martin Auden and his colleagues, they both talk about the same thing, that relocation of problem individuals only have short-term local effects, and it shifts problem from one area to the another. In fact, Dr. Fernando's later paper in 2012 was called translocating the problem, or translocating the elephant, or translocating the problem. So precisely through translocation operations, this is exactly what we are doing. So that becomes another conservation challenge, particularly in today's context. And I'll give you a few examples, a couple of them from Sri Lanka and a few from India, southern India, where we've had first-hand experiences. So in this case, this was a large makna, a tuskless male that was collared in Sri Lanka. He was named Brigadier because of his massive size, and he was translocated from Madurai to Telehera, from the eastern part to the western part. From the western part to the eastern part. Now, finally, what happened was he started moving around a lot near his release site. He started exploring. Finally, he reached the coast. He started swimming in the assumption, probably under the assumption that he could swim back to his natal range, or the area from where he was captured and brought from. A few days later, the Navy actually reported seeing an elephant. So this was a very distant footage that was shot by the Navy. It's a screenshot of a video that was shot by Navy. And he was actually found swimming close to 4 kilometers away from the shore. So it was to that extent that he had actually been swimming over the last couple of days. He was almost exhausted. The Navy had to literally, use pulleys and ropes and then drag and bring him back. So he was again brought back to the coast, and then from there he was taken to another site and released. He was released at a different site, and at that release site, unfortunately, he fell into a well and died. So this is what happens when you translocate an animal. You could either shift the problem, you could either get into extremely difficult, tricky situations such as these, and eventually lose the animal. And we have three classic cases in the past 1 year, or a little more than a year. I'll start with I'll talk about it chronologically. The image on extreme right, Vellore Tusker, he was actually captured from Coimbatore in 2017. So there was a drive operation. Now this is again another challenging part of drive operation. So unless there's some kind of coordinated decision when drive operations are carried out, it could lead to unprecedented encounters between elephants and humans, leading to casualties. So in this case, the elephant was being driven from Vellore in Coimbatore back to the forest one early morning, and he was running through fields, and in the middle of one of those maize and banana fields, there was a house, and the entire family, 4 of them, were actually sleeping outside the house, which is a regular practice in many parts of Tamil Nadu. All 4 of them, in a matter of few seconds, were run over by this elephant. He trampled all 4 of them to death. And then he went inside one of these sugarcane or maize fields, and finally, from there, he was darted, captured, and then translocated to the Annamalai Tiger Reserve. A few days later, he was creating some issues closer to the Paramikulam Dam. A lot of staff, I was doing my fieldwork then way back in 2017. A lot of staff actually reported seeing one young male who was regularly chasing vehicles or charging at people and so on. A few days later, that just went off. Later that year, this fellow was found along the foothills around Setumade region. Some of the trackers who were able to identify this individual told me that he was found near this region. And then one fine morning, unfortunately, one of the farm watchers also got killed. Nobody knows which elephant, but the watchers were actually saying that it was the same young male that actually killed the farm watcher. So they deployed kumkis and they attempted to drive the animal back. And for roughly about a year and a half, there were no issues at all. Sometime later last year in 2019 November, he started venturing out. He went all the way till Udumalpet boundary, and from there was no other option but to capture and take this animal into captivity. Same was the case with Chinnathambi, where in January 2019 there was a court order suggesting that the animal may be captured from Coimbatore and translocated to the Annamalais. After he was translocated to the Annamalais, he started moving. He moved close to 100 kilometers and went all the way till Palani foothills and came back and settled down in this place called Madathukulam close to Udumalpet for about a period of 15 days. And then there was a lot of legal battles, people opposing further removal of this animal, people supporting this and so on. And then finally the animal was, of course, captured. Now the third case in the center is this tusker called Crowbar, which was also part of one of my colleagues' study individuals in this Hosur region in Tamil Nadu. So he was again captured by Tamil Nadu Forest Department because there were repeated issues close to the Ashok Leyland factory and other parts of Hosur, and then he was taken to Mudumalai and released there. A few days later, interestingly, he was found with another herd, and then it was assumed that the animal had already settled down, and there hopefully wouldn't be any problems after that. Unfortunately, his caller failed a few days later, and the officials were not able to gather his information. And what happened was, after a few more days, he came out of the Bandipur Mudumalai complex into the human use areas of Gundlupet. One person was killed, and another person was injured. And finally, that animal also had to be taken into captivity. What this actually tells us, the take home is, the translocated problem males never stayed in the release protected area. Some of course come back to place of capture. In our cases, for instance, it's mostly been either a loss of orientation or probably exploring newer areas, or the fourth point, ranging over wider areas, like in case of Chinnathambi or Vellore Tusker. And so they're also settling in new areas and creating conflict. And the classic example of that is this Makna that was translocated a few years back with a huge tumor on the abdomen. A large Makna was translocated from Wayanad to Sirwani, and there were a lot of issues around the Sirwani irrigation staff quarters and so on for a few days before the animal finally succumbed to the tumor and died near the reservoir. Near the transferred site, there have been reports of animals killing more people, and there have also been cases where, because of repeated issues, animals have also been killed by people in retaliation. I mean, in defense, using electrocution or poisoning. So, in a gist, management measures such as translocation only leads to wider spread and intensification of conflict. The other one is drives. The other one popularly used are drives. Now let's look at it more scientifically. So this, as I mentioned in the beginning of this talk, it was of academic interest to me to understand how these animals respond to these drives in terms of their behavior and hormonal profiles. What we found was, irrespective of their age classes, except for juveniles, we found that drive actually led to significant increase in their hormonal, the mean hormonal concentration, what are called fecal glucocorticoid metabolite, which is largely considered as an indicator of stress. The other bigger, in many of these cases, what was really fortunate was that in case of our study individuals, we actually found that the hormone levels went up, but they also came down subsequently, which also indicated that this is perhaps acute stress response and not necessarily chronic stress response. The moment it starts shifting to chronic stress response, going by what is already known in literature, it starts affecting their immune responses, their reproductive processes, their digestive process, and so on. Perhaps a large proportion of deaths reported in captivity are perhaps because of chronic stress, because chronic stress is known to affect the immune system and digestive system. And this is exactly what has contributed to a large number of deaths in captivity, for instance, especially in Kerala. Now, the other larger issue with drives, for instance, this was again in southern Sri Lanka. There are a few major areas that support large numbers of elephants. Yala National Park, of course, is famous for its leopards and tourist attraction and so on. There's Udavalawe National Park further west. There's Lunugam-Vera National Park as well. From Lunugam-Vera National Park, way back in 2004, the Department of Wildlife Conservation identified 106, a group of 100, not a group, multiple groups using one area, about 106 elephants. But eventually, when they started the drive, they realized that it was not just 106. There were more elephants using that area. So it was about a week to 10-day long operation that they started driving all the elephants that they encountered. 225 elephants were actually in total driven from all the adjoining areas into Lunugam-Vera National Park, and they were all fenced. The fences were well maintained, and they ensured that the animals were staying within Lunugam-Vera. What happened was, from the drive area, so this is the drive area from where the animals were driven back to Lunugam-Vera. What is interesting is, after the drive, there were 400 more elephants actually using that area. So that clearly indicates that they underestimated the number, and more importantly, even if you drive elephants, this empty space could probably prompt other elephants from the neighboring areas to come and settle or come and start colonizing those areas. What in turn also happened is, so these are images of elephants from Lunugam-Vera National Park after the drive happened. When such large numbers of elephants were actually driven into a place like Lunugam-Vera, particularly with limited amount of resources. So Lunugam-Vera is not a very large park; it's a very small park. It's just one block of it's called the Block 5 of Yala National Park. So it's not very large, and it's typically dry thorn vegetation, dominated by Acacia prosopis and so on. There's also a lot of lantana and other weed invasion. So the amount of resources available for these elephants is very, very limited. As a result, what happened? The body condition of these animals started dropping drastically. Several of these animals actually met with end because of starvation. A large number of deaths were reported. So that was way back in 2004-05. It's been 15 years. I went there again 2019, and I found that a lot of the animals still continue to have extremely poor body condition, simply because there are still large numbers of elephants using that part of the area, but there's very little forage that's actually available. So the other tricky part is also that when nutrition is limited, when resources are scanty, and there's intense competition happening, that could in turn affect these animals' reproductive cycles, which also means that parturition could probably be a very rare phenomenon. If you even so, something that has been of academic interest to Dr. Fernando and I, particularly in the context of Lunugam has been that the adult female to calf ratio, which we typically consider to measure the reproductive health of a population in Lunugam at least through surveys seems very skewed. So typically in a very, very healthy population, if you look at adult females, they are often accompanied by two offsprings. You will have one dependent offspring, and you will have dependent as in one lactating offspring, and then another slightly older offspring. So every adult female would have these two individuals, and if there are many adult females actually with either one offspring or with almost no offspring, either they are not lactated, either the offspring has died, or if they haven't given birth at all, if they are nulliparous females. If there are several such cases reported from the population, that clearly indicates that there is a demographic skew in the population, and the population may not have long-term future. Now, the third most important challenge, particularly in today's context, has been these behavioral, interesting behavioral, adaptations that we have been observing. So this is typically what we would call as all-male groups or bachelor groups in elephants. And one of my colleagues did his PhD exclusively looking at the all-male groups of elephants using the Tumkur Hasan Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary landscape. And what he found was that all-male groups have always been reported. There have been several instances of all-male groups being reported from several parts of the country very well before as old as the 1970s and 1980s and so on. Even people like M. Krishna apparently have written about male bands. But what is interesting is the earlier assumption was that a lot of these male-male associations, for instance, in elephants are typically female philopatric, and females form long-term bonds, and males are observed to be dispersing from natal herds when they just about attain sexual maturity, and of course bond with other males, but on a temporary basis. But what Nishant, my colleague's work, actually found was that many of these associations are actually long-term. So in some sense, probably they are all forming a group, and this could have a lot to do with the changing resources, the changing anthropogenic regimes, and so on. And his study also shows the importance of having some of these dominant individuals to actually bring many others under control, and the significance or what could possibly critically affect the group if the key individuals within a group. So let's say, to give an example, just giving some random thoughts here. Let's say the individual in the center, in this case, is the key individual connecting with several other bulls in the area, forming the bull group. And if he is the one who is actually taking the less disturbed areas, and if he is the one who is aware of the landscape, for instance, removing him could contribute to intensifying of the conflict, because the others are probably not as aware as him in terms of navigating through this extensive human use maze of landscapes. Going back to history, this is exactly what I was talking about. So this General Coase, who's written, John Coase, who has written about this in 1791, he says the Gundas or the large males come out singly or in small parties, sometimes in the morning but commonly in the evening, and they continue to feed all night upon the long grass that grows amidst swamps and marshes, and of which they are extremely fond. And this is exactly what I indicated earlier also when I spoke about Chinnathambi, that males are known to actually access rich nutrition simply because they have to bulk up, because must is again a very expensive affair. As often, however, as they have an opportunity, they commit depredations on the rice fields, sugar canes, and plantain trees that are near, which oblige the farmers to keep regular watch under a small cover erected on the tops of few long bamboos about 14 feet from the ground. So as old as 1791, there have been instances of such all-male groups actually forming, associations and coming into these croplands. And what is happening in the Anthropocene? So this is one of Nishant's study group. The image on top. It's also the image is also courtesy of their research program, the Frontier Elephant program. And what they have been finding is several of these associations are actually long term. And what is also important is to see the kind of behavioral modifications that they're actually showing. In case of Tumkur elephants, for instance, they extensively use the large water bodies all through the day. They just lie down in the water bodies, something pretty much comparable with the feral buffaloes that we see here. They use these water bodies all through the day and then get into croplands during the night and then feed on the crops and then come back again, either to these water bodies or small eucalyptus plantations or similar refuges that they find nearby. The image below is actually from Chhattisgarh, and another a friend of mine is actually studying elephants in Chhattisgarh. And till a while ago, Chhattisgarh had very few individuals actually shuttling between the neighboring states. So currently, Chhattisgarh apparently has close to about 250 elephants. So it's clearly not one of an offshoot population that we can actually rule out. It's a fairly stable population. 200 elephants out of the total 20,000 odd individuals in this country is perhaps a very important number. And what is really exciting is the radio collaring studies of these elephants are actually showing that they are ranging as wide as 2,000 square kilometers. So that clearly shows how much they have been able to range. Now, David also perhaps would be knowing about this now after a very, very, very long time, probably close to 100 years. Elephants have started colonizing, not just moving into Madhya Pradesh, but have started colonizing in Madhya Pradesh. Now you have good numbers of elephants in Bandhavgarh Tiger Reserve. A few of them, I think, a couple of them have also moved into Kanha Tiger Reserve in the recent past. Excuse me. Now this is another really exciting or interesting thing that I love showing to my audience whenever I give a talk. And this also turns out to be my supervisor, Professor Anindya Sinha, his graph. So this was part of my master's work when we were actually comparing the behavioral responses of elephants to drives or other human disturbances. And we collected samples by taking a window of inference into consideration and then attempted a correlation between the behavioral response and physiological response. We actually found that there were a few individuals, so each dot here is an individual. So there were a few individuals who consistently had high hormone concentrations but continued to show very, very, very low behavioral responses, like that of Monica, the individual that I showed earlier. Consistently, her hormone values were really high, but at the same time, she never displayed any kind of stress-related behavior such as increased vigilance or mock charges or even charge and so on. But at the same time, there were other individuals who were, always jittery, very, very jittery of human presence. I'll show some videos later in about a minute or so. But had very low glucocorticoid concentrations or the stress hormone concentration. So if one were to actually draw parallels with human society, you can actually say that, people who vent out their anger tend to have lower blood pressure. That's not the exact analogy, but to put it in simple terms for people to understand, I think that's something very, very similar, that you vent out your anger, you suppress your behavioral responses or you suppress your physiological responses. But more importantly, this graph also tells me about the importance of individual idiosyncrasies. So now that's where the importance of individual personalities in elephant comes into picture. So Monica, in this case, has been a very, had been a very, very calm individual. She, of course, died of old age a while ago. There are also individuals like Vinayagar, for instance, here. He's a large bull. He must be about 5.5 or 6 plus tons. Despite all that, people are actually getting that close that he's of course, it's risky, and habituating an animal to human presence like this can, of course, backfire at some point or the other. But what is really remarkable is to see how the animal is tolerant of human presence and how amazingly he's learned to live alongside humans. So this individual personality is what really, really is important while making conservation decisions. Simply because it's it's perhaps a huge injustice to the species saying Asian elephants do this, or Asian elephants in India do this, or even Asian elephants in southern India or Asian elephants in the Anamales do this. There are individual level variations, and your management measures actually have to take into consideration. There are logistical constraints for a manager. It's very, very difficult to actually consider at individual level before making a decision. Considering the other complexities that could potentially arise out of this, it's really important that the manager considers this. So before I wrap up, I'll show you a couple of videos. This also shows how elephants respond to different situations. So in this case, for instance, you can see how jittery the animals are. Two people riding a moped are just driving through a herd of about 40 odd elephants apparently, and they're all just running away. This is again from Sri Lanka, but it's quite amazing to actually see how even elephants living within human-use landscapes are not so used to them that they are getting frightened and running away even from a moped. This is just the contrary. This was a video I shot a few years ago from Chinnar. Two people, despite all the warnings that forest department people who were standing alongside the road gave them to not ride through until the elephants crossed the road, decided to just cross. Decided to just cross the road and had a near-to-death experience. If it was a few more, had they failed in getting up and running, they probably would have been trampled by the animal. Now, that just shows the difference. In the earlier video, they were jittery of elephant presence. They ran away from a motorcycle. In this case, they are actually charging at a motorcycle. But having said that, in the absence of any kind of disturbances, this is exactly how they behave. So this is a small fragment bordering the T. Just shows how relaxed they can or how adapted they can. So he heard a small noise in between and suddenly he got up and he goes back to sleep again. And in a bit, the older female also actually goes to sleep. This is broad daylight. This is middle of the day that the animals actually behave in this way. So the last part that I'm really excited to talk about is that for all of you, all of you who are associated with nature societies or natural history societies, you must all be aware of the efforts such as eBird, for instance, eBirds or Sea Watch and so on. So a few years ago, we actually realized that we were getting a lot of images from local community people, and, sometimes tourists, very often from local drivers who were encountering elephants on a regular basis, enthusiastic naturalists and photographers and so on. We started compiling them to just on a just because of our enthusiasm and curiosity, and this is exactly what we started saying. So we were literally getting precise location level information of individuals shot by different people. They showed us how so these images actually gave us a very strong idea of tracking elephants using just citizen science data, for instance. So we spoke about different kinds of population monitoring. You can do transect lines and waterhole counts and other things. I was telling earlier how some of these can be challenging in Indian conditions, for instance. But when you have increasingly number of elephants using urban landscapes, something that is perhaps worthwhile to explore are citizen science initiatives like these. And what is really exciting is also that some of our supporters and friends have regularly contributed in and helped us build a database such as this. So there's a Google Drive where we upload all the images and maintain them there. And over the years, we've even been able to arrive at minimum convex polygon for one particular individual, for instance. Now we have a fair idea of the spatio-temporal patterns of movements of this individual. One of the tuskers that I had shown earlier. He is known to use a fairly large area of roughly about 250 square kilometer, all the way from Nilliyampati in the Annamalais, Nilliyampati in close to Paramikulam, all the way till Setumade and Topslip in the Annamalai Tiger Reserve. The aerial distance must be somewhere close to about 45 kilometers. So I think I can probably just go on and on and on talking about elephants, but I don't want to stay between you and your dinner. Before I wrap up, I would like to thank my PhD supervisors, Professor Anindya Sinha, Dr. Anand Kumar, and Dr. Ritu Fernando, and of course, Dr. Jenny Pastorini for creative discussions and helping me build my knowledge on the species. And my colleagues at NCF, Divya, Sridhar, and Ganesh, who also helped me explore the landscape, learn more about not just the species and also about conservation conundrums in this field and in large conflict mitigation scenarios. And Mr. Tangaraj Paneerselvam, who has always been a very motivating person, he's spent close to 35 years in the Animals as a forest department officer, retired sometime earlier, the year before last, mid-year before last, but continues to motivate, inspire, support, even logistics-wise, all of us on field. And the work has been possible only because of continued support from both Tamil Nadu and Kerala forest departments, research permits, and so on, and also because of the financial support that we have received very generously from the elephant family, for instance, particularly for my PhD work. And there were also other organizations that have supported us, such as the Dhoni Nilekani Foundation and Oracle and so on. So I'd be happy to actually take questions at this point, and we can probably wrap up in a bit.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sridhar. It was wonderful. We just opened the chat box so they can come there. Probably you can go through it and start answering.
How do I open the chat box again?
It's already there, down there. It will be pop up.
So I just stop the screen share, I guess, no?
Yeah, it'll be there.
Okay. Okay, yeah, now I can see the chat box. Yeah. Okay, where do I start from? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to start from this. How is the poaching scenario and ivory? Is it a problem in the Indian context? I think, it's probably not as intense as what it used to be in the 80s and 90s, I think. Especially in the south, many of the populations are fairly well protected, especially in many parks, many protected areas of Kerala. The protection is fairly intense. So that's not been a very large scale threat. But at the same time, there are also poaching cases reported in the last half a decade or so, even within Kerala, for instance, from places like Adamalaya. There have been cases where close to about 20 odd carcasses were, found without tusks. And finally, the case was also, closed, where they found the accused and they were all prosecuted. But in the larger Indian context, I think even in the northeastern part of the country, poaching still continues to be a threat. What has really been alarming is that besides the ivory poaching, now several parts of Southeast Asia, particularly in Cambodia, Laos, and some parts of Myanmar, there's been extensive poaching for skin. So the skin is actually being taken and being shipped to places like China, for instance, to make beads and several other decorative articles. So that's been really alarming because earlier it was only the males that were being targeted by the ivory poachers because, of course, the Asian females don't have tusks. But now that they have also started poaching for skin, the females are also being targeted. Which actually could be detrimental to the population and could lead to sudden collapses of certain limited, less viable populations. Is there only one species of elephant in India? Yes, there's only one species of elephant, not just in India, across Asia. There are claims about subspecies being present in different areas, but there's no large-scale genetic differences between these. So largely, we call all of them as Asian elephants. Be it in Sri Lanka, be it in Thailand, be it in India. It's very difficult to draw lines between countries like India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and all, because the elephants from India go to Bangladesh and so on. So you can't say that there's one species in Bangladesh and one in Nepal and so on. So it's mostly the Indian subcontinent, and then you have the other places like Sri Lanka and so on. Male elephants need to bulk up before must. When they come into must, do they feed significantly less? Yes, that's right. So when they come into must, they range wider, primarily in search of potential mates. At that time, usually we have seen that the animals tend to feed significantly less, which is pretty evident from the reduced body condition indexes, reduced body condition index of males just after must. Visible physical signs of stress seen in wild and captive elephants. In wild elephants, it's very tricky, but usually we see signs of alertness. We see them with open ears and raised head, and sometimes they mock charge, sometimes they charge, and so on. But in case of captive elephants, it's very evident because most of the head swaying, head bobbing, and any kind of repetitive movement that animals actually show are clear-cut signs of stress. So whatever arguments that people make in terms of animals are dancing or animals are being happy by showing these swaying movements and all, it is all just false information. It is clearly a sign of stress, particularly in captivity. It's caused by prolonged confinement. In captive establishments like forest camps, where elephants have ad libitum access to water, resources, mates, social partners, and so on, where they're let out for grazing all through the day, you don't necessarily see that amount of, or that frequent, or that intense stereotypic behavior. Sometimes you don't see stereotypic behavior at all. So that clearly shows that animals that are under prolonged confinement actually have stress. The role of lodges, operators, or park managers to sensitize people, as people in central India have never lived with elephants and have no understanding. I think there are research organizations that are now taking initiatives to better understand elephants. And so in central India, there was a recent workshop also conducted by the Ministry of Environment and Forests for the north central landscape, encompassing Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, and so on. So what you could potentially do is gather some of the basic information. We could we'll also be happy to provide some kind of basic information that you could use to make pamphlets and circulate them across your tour operators and so on. So that could be a first step. And let's see how it goes, because I'm told that in places like Kanha, the forest department is not very happy having the elephants, and they are attempting to drive them back, or they could even end up getting captured and go to captivity. The elephants claim to be seen at Agasthyamala. I've only heard about that, but I don't know. I don't think there are there's definitely no genetic variation, is what I got to know. Second thing is this there was an elephant that was believed to be this Kalana, or the dwarf elephant of the Agasthyamala. He was captured, he was rescued rather, in a very weak condition by the forest department a few years ago. Now you can actually see the elephant is trained and is being deployed by forest department for patrolling and other such operations. His name is also Agastyan. It's a fairly well-grown young bull now, sub-adult bull. Very good body condition. You can so it clearly rules out that the elephants in Agasthyamala are probably dwarf, or he was just a juvenile when he was captured, and he just grew up and then became not a Kalana. How do you collect hormone data? So I collect my hormone data. I forgot to mention that. Thanks for that question. I collect my hormone data, or I gather my hormone information through dung samples. So depending upon our questions, we usually collect dung samples, corresponding to certain occasions. So as I mentioned earlier, if I'm to look at the correlation between certain behavioral traits, what I usually do is there's a window of inference of about 36 to 48 hours. After the measure of hormones that you get from the dung is usually a collated information gathered over 36 to 48 hours within the animal. So that's what we take into consideration. And typically, it has to be collected within 1 to 2 hours of defecation. Fortunately, elephants in Valparai are visible through the day. So, observing them defecate and collecting sample has been logistically very convenient for me. Very, very easy rather. How well do you suggest that the iron fence used in Nagarhole, Bandipur landscape and Karnataka, because there have been many fatalities, for example, elephants? Exactly. I agree with you. The iron fences are probably not a good measure, because see, at the end of the day, the umbrella objective, the larger motive is to, of course, conserve elephants. So in that context, I think the iron fences probably doesn't really help. And more importantly, if you're going to, if it is not very well planned and executed, if you're just going to confine elephants to a particular small area, it could be very similar to what happened in Lungaon, where about a decade and a half ago. The use of honeybee housing along the fences to keep elephants away from the farm. Is there any data available for such use in India or Sri Lanka? Yes, they have done trials both in India and Sri Lanka, and it has been quite a failure in both the countries. It is supposedly working in Africa fairly well, apparently. But logistically, there are a few questions that would immediately arise to many of our minds, for instance. One is bees are known to be diurnal, especially the species that are being deployed. And elephant movement inside farmlands are usually in the night hours. So whether the bees will be active enough to actually, attack the elephants in the night hours is something that we still don't know. And the species of bee that were used for the trials in India and Sri Lanka are less aggressive compared to what they actually used in Africa. I think what they used in Africa was Apis mellifera scutellata. So that one actually was found to be having more aggressive response than what was actually used in India. So it has the trials so far has not given us positive results. The Sri Lanka incident is disturbing. Yes, my suggestion: translocation only can be the last option. Capture shouldn't even be an option, probably. Unless or otherwise, you have no other options left. So definitely, it is something that needs to be reconsidered. Has there been an increase in number of tuskless elephants in India? Again, like I said, at the country level, the demographic information that we have is probably very scanty, that we cannot conclusively say that there's been an increase number of tuskless males. But at least from some of my colleagues and friends who've been working in the Northeast, what I hear is that in the Northeast, at least, there's been an increase in the number of tuskless males. In the South, I guess not so much. Particularly in the Anomalies. So I've been working in the Anomalies since 2013 now, and so far I've only seen 4 tuskless males out of about 40 to 50 males that I've seen. So that that's just a very small number compared to what you actually see in Sri Lanka or the northeastern populations. Elephant parks where there are captive elephants used for activities like bathing, feeding, and rides. I'm not for it. I don't agree with it. Could you please shed some light on future perspectives for mitigation of negative interactions between humans and elephants? What's really important is to understand the context of the problem. Something that works in place A may not work for place B. So you really need site-specific interventions, particularly when it comes to conflict mitigation. So in some cases, like I mentioned earlier, you have no other option but to remove the animal. There could be some. So let's say if there's an elephant in the middle of Bangalore town, you have no other option but to actually remove it and take it elsewhere. But at the same time, if you have elephants coming to farmlands, perhaps you could consider other options before jumping into a conclusion about translocation or captures for that matter. And it is also vital to get basic information such as the animal's movement patterns and the circumstances of human fatalities, the kind of crop damage that is happening in the landscapes and so on. And for instance, basic information such as animal movement patterns can be gathered through collaring, collaring exercises. But unfortunately, today, if you collar the animal, the trend has become so much that collaring has become precedence to capture. So the moment you collar an animal, tomorrow if there's a crop damage incident or a human death, immediately they say, "Oh, beltane." The same belt elephant has come and created this problem, even if they haven't seen the animal. So that in some sense is marking the animal, and the animal is forced to be taken into captivity finally. So we really need to change our attitude and identify that collaring is not a conflict mitigation option. Collaring is actually for gathering basic information, and such basic information is actually important to mitigate the problem in the longer run, because definitely you cannot have these reactive measures going on in the longer run. You have to have some sustainable solution, and coexistence, of course, has to be taken into consideration. There are going to be more elephants. See, statistics actually show that there are roughly about 70% of elephants out of the total population in countries like India and Sri Lanka that are actually using areas outside protected areas. So in a context like that, especially in today's condition where such movement to human use landscapes are only going to intensify further, you have no other option but to consider possibilities for coexistence. What can be the things or circumstances which elephants fear? Lone tusker and a group mainly with her. If you're intending about which one we have to fear about, it's always better to actually maintain a safe distance from any kind of elephant, be them lone tusker, be them group with adults, or be them maknas. Dr. Sukumar has done a lot of study on elephants. Yes, he's been a great inspiration too. In fact, because as a kid growing up, one of the first books on one of the first scientific books on elephants that I read was Professor Sukumar's Elephant Days and Nights. So as a pioneer, I think a lot of this work has foundation laid by him. So yes, it was of course considered in our work as well. Many farmlands along with multicolor LED lights flashing in an unorganized pattern to deter elephants. Does it really help? In some places, I've seen that they deter, but perhaps may not be in the longer run because they probably could get too used to it. Even in Valparai, a lot of these shop owners actually hang these LED flashing lights, and they have told us that on those nights when they've turned on those lights, elephants have not been coming into those areas or attacking and damaging these places. Judiciary about elephants and conservation. Yes, that's true. I completely agree. Because if the judiciary probably had, more or rather a clearer picture, the Hasan capture operations could possibly be reconsidered by the Karnataka HC. Role of corridor management and identifying elephant corridors, that's a completely different talk altogether. I'd be more than happy to explain to you further detail. You can just write to me. Is all forest departments across India equipped to handle elephant conflicts? I don't think so. There are several states where elephants are actually not there. In those places, yeah. So in those places, probably the forest, like Chhattisgarh is a classic example. Even the Chhattisgarh Forest Department staff till recent past actually had no idea even to track elephants. That the Wildlife Institute of India and the Forest Department actually had to take trackers from the animalists to train fellows in Chhattisgarh to pick up tracks and then find out where they're going and so on. So I think that there needs to be some work looking at how widely the elephants are beginning to range. It is really important to hold some workshops and train them how to handle such elephant-human interaction scenarios and so on. I can send my email ID. So maybe I'll just I can just I can share my email. You can just find out my online page, and my email ID is there to those of you who have actually asked my email ID. Or if not, it's Sreedhar, SREEDHAR @ncf-india.org. The invasive plant species, yes, there's a lot of effect caused by invasive species. In the south, lantana is a major issue. Elephants for past 10 years. What I noticed that there is bulging of veins and legs and body clearly. No, the bulging of veins or the muscles becoming strengthened and all is not a disease or anything. But it's quite exciting to actually know that somebody's tracking elephants and photographing them for past 10 years. Keep up the good work. Use of elephants for tourism rights, definitely not in favor of conservation. How are elephants coping with increase in eucalyptus plantations in their past? I don't know if eucalyptus plantations are increasing. In many places, actually, eucalyptus plantations, like Valparai is a classic example where eucalyptus plantations also have, native vegetation growing within them. So in due course of time, once the eucalyptus trees die, it's probably just going to be, secondary vegetation. Elephant corridors being extinct due to huge pressure of settlement and development. The thing is, it's not just elephant corridors, it's also elephant habitats. See, I think we need to be really clear about the definition of corridors versus habitats. And it's not just about saving corridors, it's also about saving habitats to actually ensure that there's long-term conservation efforts. I noticed elephant showing... Yes, there were a few individuals that were actually showing increase in hormone surge following drive operations. That's the graph that I actually showed. Range officer Attapadi, translated, I had an experience with that. Yes, so you must be in a better position. So there's a range officer from Attapadi who has actually commented about the Makna. So I'm sure you would probably be in a better position to tell about that. It was quite a quite a disastrous decision, I guess, because eventually the animal probably would have died even in Wayanad. So taking it to Attapadi, just shifting problem in one area to the other place, I think it should have been reconsidered then. Is the hormonal data from dung of males, especially in must or post-must, reliable and tallying to reality from your experience? See, the thing is, when it comes to hormone, what is really important is you need to get the right antibodies when you're doing this, the enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay to get the hormone values. Unless you are actually using the right reagents and antibodies, you probably. So if you're using, let's say, human antibody kits to look at elephant hormones, you probably may not get right values. Sorry. Male elephants reach a certain age, they will move out of the gang. Yes, that's right. When they usually reach sexual maturity, then after certain, if they may, would immunocontraception vaccine to reduce number of population of elephants be effective in reducing conflict? See, this is exactly the point that I was mentioning earlier. That the increase in conflict incidents in India, it's probably not. At least we don't have the statistics to affirmatively say that the conflict is actually owing to increased number of elephants. So unless we have evidence showing that there is an increase in number of elephants and that is what is leading to increased conflict, I wouldn't even consider something like immunocontraception, for instance. So collaborating for sharing photos and information, you can just write to me. I've also already set my email address, so you can just write to me and then I'd be happy to take these things. For anyone who's deployed to deter elephants like forest staff, what can be useful to scare elephants? See, that's another thing that I actually missed out during the talk. This driving elephants is also a very challenging thing. If you make your drives a regular affair, for instance, you continuously blast crackers, you use fire and other things, and continuously chase elephants, for instance, they get after a point of time they get used to it. That all your further drives will only become futile. They may not really move away despite you all the efforts. So at that point of time, if you actually start driving elephants, they may actually start retaliating. They might start charging. So once they lose that fear for humans, then no measure probably can actually mitigate conflict. It is only under such situations that something like translocation, not even translocation, something like capture becomes inevitable. So I think I can actually write a message to everyone here. So I'm putting my email address right here. So if anyone wants to write to me, you guys can write to me on this one.
I just closed the chat box also. Probably you can answer 2-3 more questions and we can close it.
Yeah. So I think that I'm going to take these 2 questions. So yeah, once male elephant reaches a certain age, they will be moving out of the gang. After certain years, if that single male elephant meets that older gang, will any interaction happen? See, one thing is, while male elephants actually move out of their natal range once they hit maturity, there are instances where they actually come back to their natal range, that they also interact with their natal herd. We have observed several of those interactions. So there's nothing very surprising in that, I guess. There's very some kind of shocking interactions. It's nothing like that. It's very normal for the animal to come back. There will be greeting ceremonies and so on. At least that's what we have observed. And what's my opinion about nighttime closing of national highway in the context of elephant people conflict? Not just in the context of elephant people conflict, I think more importantly in the larger context of conservation, I think the highway closure should probably continue, because I'm sure one neglected part of human elephant conflict are the road kills, for instance. So at least to prevent intensification of road kills, that is something that should definitely continue. The closure of highway. At least that's my personal opinion. So I think David, that's it. There aren't any more questions, I guess.
Thank you so much, Sridhar. It was wonderful. And I just call Krishna Kumar sir. Sir, are you there? 1 second.
Hello.
Yes, sir. Yes, over to you, sir.
Hi, everyone. We are at the zenith of happiness because started as a very humble program at the beginning of the lockdown, This has reached to the 24th session, and that to a very grand one. Look at the chat box. Questions were avalanching like anything. That itself shows how effective this today's talk was and how exhaustively Mr. Sridhar has done the topic. Everyone was interested. It was 200 plus participants. It is a global participation that we see these days, and we are happy that we are happy and blessed that we got such a magnificent personality who could put the subject to the most effective way to the listeners, and envisaging almost all the aspects connected with the man-elephant conflict, conservation initiatives, everything. So such a wonderful session you have given us, Mr. Sridhar. Thank you very much. I would like to place on record our thanks on behalf of Kottayam Nature Society and Happy Nature History Society. I would like to thank you once again, Mr. Sridhar, having given us such a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
The pleasure is definitely mine, sir, because it's been a wonderful opportunity to actually come and talk to such large audience, in fact, and very enthusiastic audience. As you rightly pointed out, the overwhelming number of questions are an indication that people were really excited to know more about elephants, and that just makes me more happy. And whatever little I know, I was able to actually share to this audience, and whatever little effort that I put to make it as less technical as possible.
Yeah, sure.
I guess I should also probably extend my heartfelt thanks to the entire organizing team, David and everybody at the Kottayam Nature Society and the Alappuzha Natural History Society. It's definitely been a wonderful experience, and more importantly, to be a part of this exciting series of lectures by several other stalwarts in the field, like Raghu and Ravi Chellam and so on. I once again thank the organizers for inviting me to give this talk, and I also would like to thank all the audience, the 200 odd people who actually listened very patiently to this entire session. As I indicated earlier, my email address is in the chat box, so you guys can always write to me if there's anything that I can contribute to, or if there's anything that I can help with. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sridhar. Good night.
Bye. Thank you so much, Sridhar.
Yeah.